The first police cruiser rolled into my gas station at 8:42 on a frozen Tuesday morning, and the woman in the passenger seat was pointing at me like she had finally caught the most dangerous criminal in northern Wisconsin. The young officer stepped out, adjusted the body camera on his chest, and told me I'd been accused of refusing service, making threats, and frightening a paying customer. There was only one problem with her story. I was his police chief. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 58 years old at the time, and I had spent 31 years wearing a badge at North Harbor, a little town tucked between a pine forest and the cold western edge of Lake Michigan, the kind of place where everybody knows who plows your driveway, who fixed your roof, and whether your grandfather still owes somebody $5 from a cribbage game in 1974. I'd been chief for 7 years, but most mornings before work, I still held my older sister Ruth open Mercer Fuel and Market, the station our grandfather built in 1965 with one pump, a borrowed concrete mixer, and enough stubbornness to outlast 3 recessions. That morning, I was carrying a box of windshield fluid from the storage room when Elaine Whitmore marched through the front door wearing a cream-colored ski jacket, spotless leather gloves, and the expression of a woman who believed inconvenience was something the government should arrest people for. Elaine was president of the Lakeview Reserve Homeowners Association, a private development of 32 expensive vacation homes built 4 miles north of town. Most of the owners came up from Milwaukee or Chicago on weekends, enjoyed the lake when it was calm, complained about the mosquitoes when it was not, then drove home before they had to learn anybody's name. Elaine had first approached me about 18 months earlier, asking for what she called a preferred community fuel partnership. What she meant was that she wanted every Lakeview Reserve resident to receive 15% off at my pumps. I explained that my profit margin on gasoline was already thin enough to slide under a locked door, and that giving her members 15% off would mean losing money on every gallon. She smiled, tilted her head, and said, "Caleb, sometimes a local business has to invest in the kind of customers it wants to attract." Ruth was behind the register doing the crossword, and without looking up, she said, "We already attracted you, and it is not paid off yet." Elaine did not appreciate that. She left without buying coffee, then spent the next year visiting nearly every family-owned business in North Harbor, asking for HOA discounts on firewood, groceries, snow removal, boat repairs, even smoked whitefish. Old Frank Dombrowski at the hardware store told her, "Lady, the trees charge me the same whether you live behind a gate or not." That line traveled around town faster than the winter flu. Elaine did not laugh, but she did stop shopping there. Now she was back at my station, demanding 10 gallons of premium and a private wholesale agreement for what she vaguely described as an HOA emergency fuel system. When I refused again, her polite voice disappeared. She leaned over the counter and said, "People like us bring money into this town, Caleb. Your little station survives because communities like mine allow it to." I looked past her at the snow piling against the windows, then at the faded photograph of my grandfather above the register. "Elaine," I said, "this station was here before your gate, before your clubhouse, and before anybody decided lakefront property needed a committee. You were welcome to buy gas at the posted price, or you were welcome to leave." She pulled out her phone, called 911, and told the dispatcher I was aggressive, unstable, and possibly armed. That last part was technically true considering the badge and duty pistol on my belt. But she somehow failed to mention those. 6 minutes later, Officer Noah Briggs arrived, 25 years old, fresh out of field training, and pale enough to tell me he already knew something felt wrong. He started his official introduction, so I raised one hand and said, "Noah, before we go any further, key your radio and ask dispatch who is standing behind this counter." He did. The answer came back immediately. "Chief Mercer is on scene." Elaine's face changed, but only for a second. Then she lifted her chin and said, "Well, that hardly makes him innocent." Noah looked at her, opened his notebook, and calmly replied, "No, ma'am. But it does mean I'm going to record every word you say very carefully, especially the part where you explain why the security camera shows you threatening him before you called us." For the first time that morning, Elaine stopped talking. And that silence was the first crack in something much bigger than either of us understood. Elaine finally cleared her throat and said she may have overstated a few details because she had been under pressure from the HOA board, which was a very polished way of admitting she had lied to the police. Noah wrote down her exact words, then asked her to step outside while he reviewed the security footage. I stood behind the counter watching snow scrape across the parking lot, and something about her reaction kept bothering me. She was embarrassed, sure, but she was not scared. People who make a foolish complaint usually start looking for an exit once they realize the cameras are running. Elaine looked like someone whose first plan had failed, but who still believed she had 3 more in her pocket. Ruth leaned close and said, She did not come here for 10 gallons of gas. I told her I knew that, although the truth was I did not yet know what she had come for. Noah drove Elaine back to the entrance of Lakeview Reserve without issuing a citation. But the body camera footage, dispatch recording, and incident report were preserved. Before lunch, I called Lieutenant Maria Velez at the State Police Office in Green Bay. Maria and I had trained together years earlier, and she had the useful habit of becoming quieter whenever a situation got worse. I told her about Elaine's request for wholesale fuel, her reference to an emergency fuel system, and the false complaint she had just made. There was a pause on the line followed by the sound of a keyboard. Then Maria said, "Caleb, her name is already in our system." There were 9 complaints connected to Elaine Whitmore or Lakeview Reserve over the previous 2 years, including 2 disputed police reports, a contractor fraud allegation, and an anonymous tip from a former maintenance worker who claimed the HOA had buried a fuel tank near the old pump house without permits. I felt my hand tighten around the phone. "How old is the tip?" I asked. 4 months, Maria said. No photographs, no exact coordinates, and the caller stopped answering. The former employee's name was Owen Kessler, a 64-year-old mechanic who had worked at Lakeview Reserve from the day the first foundation was poured until Elaine fired him for questioning a stack of invoices. I knew Owen. He had repaired my father's snowblower every winter for 20 years and once drove 40 miles through an ice storm to fix Ruth's furnace without charging her. I found him that afternoon in a metal workshop behind his house, rebuilding the transmission on an old Ford pickup. He listened while I explained why I was there, then wiped his hands on a rag and stared at the concrete floor. "I reported that tank because I helped install it," he said. Elaine told us it was for backup generators, but the plan showed a storage shed, not a fuel system. A year later, I saw residents filling their trucks at the pump and signing their names in a private ledger. When I asked where the money went, she fired me. Owen opened a rusted cabinet and pulled out a plastic storage box containing photographs, delivery slips, handwritten fuel logs, and copies of checks issued from the HOA Reserve Fund to a company called Whitmore Community Services. The company belonged to Elaine and her husband, Richard. The document showed that they had used HOA money to install the tank, bought gasoline at retail, resold it to residents at a markup, then charged the HOA additional management fees for operating the system. That was why Elaine wanted my wholesale rate. She was not trying to save her neighbors money. She wanted to widen her profit margin without paying for licensing, inspections, or environmental safeguards. Maria arranged a quiet meeting the next morning with a county prosecutor and an environmental inspector named Jonah Patel. Jonah studied Owen's photographs for nearly 20 minutes, especially the ones showing dark soil around the concrete pad and a drainage ditch that ran downhill toward the lake. He finally looked up and said, "If this tank is leaking where I think it is, we are not discussing a paperwork violation. We are discussing contaminated groundwater." The investigation moved quickly after that. Soil samples were collected under the cover of a routine shoreline inspection. Financial records were subpoenaed, and 3 HOA residents admitted they had paid cash for fuel because Elaine told them it was cheaper that way. It was not cheaper. She had been charging nearly 40 cents above the local retail price while telling everyone she was protecting the community from greedy small businesses. Then a second witness appeared. Her name was Diane Foster, the HOA treasurer, a quiet widow who arrived at my house after dark carrying a cardboard box and a casserole she was too nervous to remember she had brought. For 11 months, Diane had copied every invoice Elaine asked her to approve. Inside that box were bank statements, altered meeting minutes, and proof that more than $180,000 had been moved from the HOA reserve account into Elaine's private company. Diane kept apologizing for waiting so long. I told her fear has its own timetable, and showing up late is still better than never showing up at all. What Elaine did next removed any doubt that she believed herself untouchable. She filed a formal petition demanding that the town revoke Mercer Fuel and Market's business license, claiming my station was unsafe, outdated, and harmful to Lakeview Reserve's property values. She requested a public hearing and promised to bring the entire HOA board. The prosecutor read the petition, looked at me across her desk, and almost smiled. Elaine had just selected the date, the room, and the audience for her own collapse. The hearing was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Thursday night, and by 6:30 the North Harbor Town Hall was full enough that people were standing along the back wall with coffee cups in their hands. Elaine arrived in a navy suit, pearls, and the same cream-colored coat she had worn the morning she called the police on me, carrying a leather folder thick enough to make it look like she had already won. Richard sat beside her, smiling at anyone who looked their way while Diane took a seat 3 rows back and kept both hands folded in her lap. Elaine had no idea that 4 miles north, state investigators and an environmental response crew were already waiting outside the Lakeview Reserve gate. The first few agenda items were routine: snow contracts, road repairs, a dispute about a fishing dock. Then the town clerk called Elaine's petition. She walked to the podium slowly, adjusted the microphone, and spent nearly 10 minutes describing my station as outdated, unsafe, and incompatible with the future of the community. She said Lakeview Reserve had invested millions in the shoreline, while businesses like mine refused to modernize or cooperate. Then she looked directly at me and said, "Some people confuse being here a long time with having the right to stand in the way of progress." I could hear Ruth behind me whisper, "Lord, give me patience, because if you give me strength, this meeting is ending early." When Elaine finished, the board chairman asked for my response. I walked to the podium with one sheet of paper. I explained that Mercer Fuel had been licensed continuously since 1965, had passed every state inspection, and had never received an environmental citation. Then I looked at Elaine and said, "This station does not need to defend itself against claims with no evidence, but since Mrs. Whitmore is concerned about public safety, I believe the board should hear the emergency report that was added to tonight's agenda." Elaine turned toward the clerk. She had not noticed the added item. At that exact moment, Maria entered through the side door in uniform, followed by Jonah Patel and the county prosecutor. Richard's smile disappeared first. Maria stepped to the microphone and announced that investigators had executed the search order at Lakeview Reserve, where they had discovered an unlicensed underground fuel tank, contaminated soil, falsified records, and evidence that HOA reserve funds had been diverted into a private company controlled by Elaine and Richard Whitmore. Nobody moved. Even the old heating system seemed to stop rattling. Elaine gripped the edge of the podium and said there had been a misunderstanding, that the fuel program was a community service, that any missing permits were the responsibility of contractors. The prosecutor opened a folder and calmly replied, "We have your signatures on the construction payments, the fuel invoices, the private bank transfers, and the altered meeting minutes." Then Sheriff Tom Alvarez stood from the back row holding 2 arrest warrants. Elaine looked around the room as if she expected the people she had intimidated for years to rise and protect her. Nobody did. Diane finally looked up. Owen stood near the door with his arms crossed. Ruth gave Elaine the same quiet stare she had given her at the gas station. The sheriff placed Elaine under arrest for fraud, false reporting, and environmental violations, then arrested Richard for conspiracy and theft. Elaine kept insisting that the HOA needed her, even as she was led through the same room where she had planned to destroy my family's business. Months later, Elaine accepted a plea agreement and served 18 months in state custody. Richard received a federal sentence, and they were ordered to repay the reserve fund and cover the cleanup cost. Diane became interim HOA president, and her first proposal was a winter fuel assistance program for local families who actually needed help. Mercer Fuel contributed part of the cost, and Lakeview Reserve matched it. The strange thing is, I never felt satisfied watching Elaine leave in handcuffs. Relieved, yes. Grateful, certainly. But satisfaction is harder when you know 32 families trusted the wrong person and helped give her the powers she abused. So tell me what you think. Were the residents victims of Elaine? Or were they responsible because they ignored every warning as long as they believed they were benefiting? Leave your answer in the comments, share this story with someone who has dealt with an HOA bully, and subscribe. Because the next person who tried to control our town did not ask for a fuel discount, he tried to take the road itself.